Okay, well, the numbers adding seem to have slowed down, so we're going to move into the welcome. So good evening, everyone. Welcome to the latest transmission from the Race, Violence, and Health academic theme at Whitman College. I'm Professor Suzanne Beachy from the Politics Department, and I am truly delighted and honored to welcome Professor Melissa Harris-Perry to join us today. Her talk is going to be titled Blackness 2020, Plague, Protest, and Politics. I should say talk and then discussion, because I think there's a lot to think through here, more than polished definitive answers to be providing, lots of questions to be asking. I'm going to offer a brief introduction, although I think our guest really needs very little introduction. Professor Harris-Perry is the Maya Angelou Presidential Chair at Wake Forest University, where she teaches courses on American politics and elections at the intersection of race, place, and gender. She's the founder and president of the Anna Julia Cooper Center, an independent organization with a mission to advance justice and alleviate harm for women and girls of color in American higher education. For nearly 2 decades, Professor Harris-Perry has contributed to American public life through her distinctive combination of scholarly analysis and grounded wisdom applied to the analysis of race, gender, politics, and power. I'm sure you've encountered her writing in many venues, and she, of course, also hosted the award-winning television show Melissa Harris-Perry from 2012 to 2016 on MSNBC, and in 2016 won the Hillman Prize for broadcast journalism. She has deep commitments to diversifying American journalism and mentoring emerging public voices. Professor Harris-Perry has developed and implemented innovative mentoring efforts, including the L.com Scholars Program, centering the stories of women and girls of color and Black on campus, a national student journalism program in partnership with the nation. She's the author of award-winning Barbershops, Bibles, and BET, Everyday Talk and Black Political Thought, and Sister Citizen, Shame, Stereotypes, and Black Women in America. Her talk, as I said, is going to be on Blackness 2020, Plague, Protest, and Politics. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Melissa Harris-Perry. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. And thank you for such a lovely introduction. I greatly appreciate it. We are, I think as Professor Beachy said, we find ourselves in a moment that may offering us more questions than answers. And my goal, given how close we are not only to the last day of voting, which was last week, but also so very close to the actual election outcome, that rather than presuming that I know what everything means, I just want to provide a little framework. I'm going to take maybe like 15 minutes to do that. Maybe it'll be more like 20, but I'll try to keep it only to that amount. And then really open up the opportunity to have conversation. I know that Professor Beachy will engage with some Q&A, and then hopefully we can also do that through the Q&A and the chat functions. So here we are. I'm going to share my screen as though this isn't what we do all day in class, but here we go. So, all right. So I shifted the title even a little bit from the plague, protest, and politics, and want to think about Blackness 2020, pandemic, protest, and politics. And my goal here is really to just say, let's take a look at this. Again, I'm Melissa Harris-Perry. I'm at Wake Forest University as a faculty member. That's also my undergraduate alma mater. And I also have a new podcast. So check out the new podcast, System Check, if you have a chance. We are very new. I think we're like 2 or 3 episodes in. Okay. So 2020 has been that awful, no good, very bad year that everyone has been expressing really since about January 3rd or so. I think there was still a great deal of enthusiasm about 2020 on New Year's Eve, maybe even on New Year's Day, but it pretty swiftly became a year where, particularly for Americans who had imagined that we were entering a time of relative economic growth, who felt, even if they sometimes felt disaffected from the elected government, nonetheless, the the economy was operating in such a way that tends to benefit sort of the way that the American economy works, which is to say good for consumers, good for folks who were starting small businesses. But and especially for all of you who may have, for example, been seniors in high school last year, certainly what we know is that by the time we reached March, it became very clear how difficult 2020 was going to be. So my goal here is just to look at three of the defining aspects of this year: the pandemic, the historic protests, and politics, here defined as our American national election. And to do so from standpoints within Black communities, and to ask the question, what does 2020 look like from that perspective? All that I am going to do in this very swift scene setting set of slides is simply to provide some data. Now, it is my belief that data is a terrific place to begin, but data might give us a what, but it doesn't give us a why. It doesn't quite explain to us sort of what the meaning is. So I'm just going to kind of walk through some of these data on the three issues of pandemic, protest, and politics from the perspective of Black communities. All right, so on the question of pandemic, I mean, the first is one that you will undoubtedly already know, which is that there is an enormous disparity, not only in the incidence of COVID-19, but most crucially in the mortality rate, that African Americans are experiencing a mortality rate when age adjusted that is about 3 times or slightly higher than 3 times that of white Americans. And this age adjusted mortality rate has simply meant from the very beginning. So these are data we're looking at here from late July. These data have trended the same, although the curve did flatten for a little while, but they have trended the same in terms of the percentages across the entire pandemic in the US. They are not reflected necessarily in the same gaps in international data. So we don't believe, for example, that it's something that's being carried in Black and brown bodies, because these disparities do not cohere in other diverse nations. And you'll also see that the African American and Black mortality rate is really quite elevated, even over that of Hispanic and Latinx communities. And if you just want to see what some of that breakdown looks like by states, you can see Louisiana. So my husband grew up in New Orleans. We lived about a decade after Katrina. So my husband lived there his whole life until we moved here to North Carolina. All of our friends and family are still there. And very early on, our relationships in both New York and in New Orleans meant that we were losing people almost daily as African Americans. Not just people who were being diagnosed with COVID, but we were losing people, and it felt that feeling sort of in the spring, I would say really April and May was a brutalizing kind of experience to imagine that it was going to keep going at that rate. And it was not one that was shared equally. So it really had as much to do with us being North Carolinians with New Orleans relationships. And I had also spent the first part of my academic career for about a decade living and working in Chicago. And so again, you can just take a look at the rates in those states to see how much loss there was. Now, obviously, the first set of questions then is to begin to ask why. And part of what, again, I started by saying is that we are not living in a time of definitive answers, but really one of raising many questions. And so when we see those numbers, there is still a great deal of questioning about exactly what is causing this racial disparity. So, there was, a sense that perhaps it was about living in cities, perhaps it was about comorbidities and pre-existing conditions. Perhaps it was about being less likely to have access to adequate health care, and also about the possibility of being frontline workers. And as you can see, there is some validity in some of that data. In fact, those conditions that have high comorbidities, in other words, things that go along with COVID-19 and tend to go along specifically with coronavirus deaths and mortalities, are more prevalent in African American communities and in Black bodies. So asthma rates, diabetes rates, high blood pressure, hypertension, and obesity rates are all health indicators related to the likelihood of death from coronavirus, and are all more likely to be in Black bodies. And then there are also workforce and economic questions here. So when other folks, people like me who are college professors who were able to, certainly we didn't want to leave the classroom, but we could leave the classroom, we could work from home, we could be in a circumstance of relative safety in the context of our own households and our own workplaces. But African Americans overwhelmingly make up a higher proportion than their population in what we would call these frontline or essential workers, whether it is public transit workers or in cleaning services or in childcare or even in grocery and drug stores. So we also know that there was a higher level of exposure. And then again, economically, we know that African Americans are less likely to have paid sick leave days and less likely to have positions where they can work from home. So those aren't full answers, but what we do know is that 2020 has been a deadly year, and a disproportionately deadly year. And a disproportionately deadly year because of the realities that pre-existed in the American circumstance before the pandemic appeared. So even before there is a pandemic, there is this stratification in the workforce. There is an inability for Black folks to stay home when sick, and there are these health conditions that are wrought from a wide variety of circumstances of inequality. It's also worth noting that for both African Americans and Asian Americans, there are higher reports during the COVID-19 crisis of having had experiences of negative racial experiences. So for both Black Americans and Asian Americans, as you can see there, this sense that others in public spaces were behaving as though they were uncomfortable, or slurs or jokes. Okay, so given that this was a deadly year, that it was disproportionately deadly, and that it was disproportionately deadly related to pre-existing inequalities, the next big moment or defining aspect of this year, instead of in the spring when we saw the pandemic, is in the summer, which is truly a summer protest. Initiated in many ways by the May 25th, 2020 slaying of George Floyd by a police officer. Not only was George Floyd killed by a police officer, but that killing was grotesque, and it was caught on video. And so it is another example of televised Black death that many around the world had an opportunity to witness in the ways that we so frequently witnessed videotaped and televised Black death in those years between 2012 and 2016, which really kind of began with the end of the Zimmerman verdict, and then through to the slaying of Michael Brown and Ferguson, and then a whole cascade of Black death and particularly Black civilians who were unarmed over the course of those 2 to 3 years, but which had been less frequent in our social media and in our broadcast media over the past several years, but came back into consciousness this May. And something quite extraordinary happened. More than 10 million Americans took to the streets in protests, despite the fact, or potentially even in part because of the fact that we were in the context of a global pandemic of a highly infectious disease. Again, as we go through and talk about what all of this means, it certainly is worth noting that these were global protests, just as we are in a global pandemic. These protests were not exclusively American. They also were not exclusively African American. They were very much around a central question and a central issue of the meaning and the mattering of Black lives, but they actually mobilized millions, particularly of young people, who emerged for the purpose of indicating that all of those pre-existing inequities, which had led to 2020 already being such a deadly year in the context of the pandemic, were also having these deadly effects in spaces other than simply public health. They were also having deadly effects in American policing. You can just look at where protests showed up. And again, this was early on. This was the first 7 days. So this isn't even how it spreads over the course of the summer. So within the first week, you have protests across the country. You have protests not only on the East Coast, not only in places that are that have large Black populations, but you see them across the country. And I think it's also important to note that the National Guard was deployed also in a wide variety of spaces, including places like South Dakota, Utah, Colorado, of course, Missouri, Pennsylvania. And it might also even be worth noting which of these places that had both National Guard deployment and these very intense summer protests were also swing states. So notice there Pennsylvania, notice there North Carolina, notice there Georgia, notice the protests, although not the National Guard in Nevada. So in all of these spaces, we begin to see what is going to come next, right? This question of politics. Now, I chose this one quote by Adam Serwer in The Atlantic, where he quotes something that, again, Professor Beachy will know this research very well. It is what social scientists have called the principal policy or the principal implementation gap. The idea that Americans have long had almost near agreement on a wide variety of basic principles like freedom, equality, justice, racial equity. But once you drill down below like the broadest notion of what these big ideas are and ask about the implementation through public policy, you find enormous racial gaps where African Americans are willing to support a number of public policies that at very high majority, 75 and 80%, and are able to get fewer than a quarter of white Americans in agreement. And so part of the question that Adam Serwer was asking in this piece is whether or not this summer of protests, 2020, was leading us to a new place, or whether it would be like other moments of interracial possibility where there was an agreement on principle, but stark racial differences on implementation. All right, I'm almost done, I promise. Then we'll get here to politics. And again, I am using a very narrow definition of politics here, but I really welcome a broader discussion with all of you about what politics, how we might have a broader definition of politics about 2020. And so I just want to show you, I assume many of you have already seen the national exit polls, but if you haven't, here's a chance to see those exit polls. And I'm just going to toggle back and forth a little bit between 2020 and 2016. I wish we were together in a room. It'd be a little easier to point some of this out. I don't have a digital whiteboard here, but I just want you to look at a couple of things. So first, before you look at the red and blue boxes, move your eyes over to the left side of the page and look at the percentages that are under each of the categories. So what you'll see there is white men and white women each making up just about a third of voters, Black men making up about 5%, with Black women at 7%, which does lead to the overall 12% that is African Americans, but there aren't 2% more Black women than there are Black men. So that does indicate a higher voter turnout among Black women, which is actually fairly standard. We can talk about the reasons why and the nature of disfranchisement. I did not write these graphs, so please go yell at the, I think this is either Washington Post or New York Times did this particular one. But Latinas and Latinos, they're making up 6% and 8%. And then notice this category, all other races. Now I'm gonna toggle down to 2016 and then I'll come back, I promise. But I just want you to see that if, again, move your eye all the way over to the left-hand side there and look at the percentages, and you'll see hopefully a few things right away. So again, let me toggle back up. So here, white men in this year make up 32% of voters, but in 2016, they were 34%. Now look at 2016, white women were 37% of voters, but this year, only 33% of voters. Black men and women actually remain at 5% and 7%. Latinos and Latinas, there is a change, and I want you to particularly see a 1 percentage point increase for men and 2 percentage points for Latinas. And then, really crucial, in 2016, only 6% are in this so-called others category, which would include Indigenous people, both East and South Asians. And notice that this year, that category made up 9%, which is absolutely a critical, like the fact that they're all smushed together into one. Again, notice that is higher than Black women or Latinas, right? It's actually really crucially relevant category that we don't have any answers or don't have good answers. We have some state-based answers to who is in that category, but that category was very important this year. So I just wanted you to see that on turnout. Real quick, let me just walk through that. White men and white women gave a majority of their vote to the Republican candidate, Donald Trump, this year. But again, if we toggle back down, white men actually were much more likely to vote for the Democrat this year than they were last time. So in 2016, only 31% of white men voted for Hillary Clinton. But in 2020, 40% of white men voted for Joe Biden. And then there is this thing that happens also between Black women and Black men, where Black women give over 90% of the vote to Joe Biden, whereas only about 80% of Black men give their vote to Joe Biden. Something very similar happens where 80% of Black men voted for Clinton, but Black women were up over 90%. And the other thing you'll see is that this is a year in 2020 where Latinas are distinctively different than Latinos, right? So there's a gender divide that is for the first time really opening up here in national election exit polling, where Latinx women are at 70% for the Democratic candidate, and Latinx men are at 60%. All right, so just so you can see what young people are doing. So this is young people of color overwhelmingly supporting the Democratic candidate, whereas white young people, still a majority, supported the Democratic candidate, but by more like a toss of the coin, kind of a 50-50. And then if you want to look at some of the reasons why, just to attach us back to the protest and the pandemic, notice that the two top issues for young Biden voters were coronavirus and racism, right? These fundamental questions that emerged in the context of the pandemic and emerged in the context of the protests also drove the vote of young Biden voters. And we know that that means the vote of young voters of color and their white allies. Whereas young Trump voters, who were much more likely to be young and white, were much more likely to define the economy as their central issue. Also just worth noting that all of these election results, of course, happen not nationally, they happen in states. And again, if you want to just look at Georgia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, right, African-American voters were crucial in each of those states. And the importance of work done by local activists over the course really of a decade, Stacey Abrams being the one who, at this moment, most folks can call their names. But the work that Stacey Abrams has done literally over the past decade to help move Georgia, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania into being swing states. And of course, the other crucial moment relative to African Americans and the national election is the historic moment of the election of the first African American and first South Asian American vice president. So 2020 has been the year of the pandemic, of protest, and of politics. And the question is, will 2021 be the year of power? All right. So what I want to do is say thank you and to engage in questions and conversation.
Great. Thank you so much for that sort of bird's eye overview. And I do want to invite folks to use the Q&A box to offer questions. We also have opened up the liking feature that will allow you to move up a question that you'd particularly like to get answered higher up in the queue. So please use that Q&A box to offer some questions. I'm going to start off with a couple here while folks get their questions in the box. But, you know, I was really struck about thinking about the role of media as we're thinking about pandemics, protests, and politics across 2020. And I wonder, from your perspective, what do you see as the media doing well? Where do you see, if anything, where do you see, you know, the media needing to do better? And what can we as consumers of media do to navigate some of those gaps?
So I think it's always really important to disaggregate media in the same way that we disaggregate, you know, that's why we wanted to look at a crosstab, right, of gender and race as we were thinking about voter choice, for example. So if we're going to disaggregate media, what I would say is I think print media is actually doing a fairly extraordinary job over the course of really the past 4 years, but especially over the past year. And I will name one thing in particular in 2020 that that print media did that I found impressively public oriented in its choice, which is that nearly all print media made coronavirus reporting free, which is to say they took it out of their paywall. So now this isn't quite true anymore. But in the first sort of 3 months, when we were in fact still just trying to map the disease and map the infections and understand even what any of it meant for our lives, New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, they all took coronavirus reporting from behind their paywall so that any person could simply click on it and have access to it. And that move alone was indicative of sort of where or how print media was thinking about, and I mean print here to mean both digital as well as print, because they really are intertwined at this point. And how they understand their responsibility to the public. Now, compare that to cable news. So I'll go into radio and podcast broadcast in a second, but let's just take print media and then let's go to cable news. And what could only be described as basically a 4-day hostage taking of the American people from Tuesday night through to, or 5-day, I guess, from Tuesday night through to Saturday. And like, it got to a point, I'm sorry, I have to laugh because it reached a point of madness when, by Friday night, if you're still saying the words, okay, a candidate needs 270 electoral. Yeah, we know, everyone knows, we all know that it takes 270 electoral college votes. We know exactly which votes. We know the name of the, he's Gabrielle from Georgia just got to be like my favorite cult hero here, right? Because, consistently the CNN reporters would say that he was the Secretary of State. And he was like, I'm not the Secretary of State. I am the Superintendent of Elections. It was really fabulous. So what you saw relatively blatantly there was a kind of ratings chasing. Because of course, yes, there was an important contestation at the presidential level, but that was only going to be decided when the votes were counted, or at least counted to a certain point, which meant that there was actually plenty of time to report on lots of other things, right? So rather than just spinning the 220 and keeping the banner at the bottom, that's for 3 days, the banner at the bottom read, Biden about to win, it was just crazy town. Instead of reporting on what was happening in the House races, instead of reporting what was happening in state legislative races, instead of talking about what was happening in the California propositions races. And in fact, I would argue pretty strongly and based on personal experience that it was exactly that kind of cable news reporting that had a lot to do with the entire reason that that President Trump, or that candidate Trump, became President Trump. So what can we do? We can be the most responsible consumers as we can be. I've always encouraged people and urged people, don't reward cable news for its bad behavior. They're putting you on the edge like that because they want you to watch. So if you watch, you've rewarded it. I promise you, I have not watched cable news in 5 years. I haven't watched for 5 years until this weekend, right? It was the first time I'd watched, which is why I was like, oh God, has it been like this the whole time? And there's never been any moment across, I guess, 4.5 years, across those 4.5 years, when I haven't known everything of importance that was going on. And so I promise you, if you turn it off, if you turn on NPR, BBC, I listen to actually a fair bit of right-wing radio as well, because audio is just fascinating to me. I'm interested in how the stories are told, and I'm a big fan of a variety of different kinds of podcasts. So I'd say it's a mixed bag of very responsible print reporting, very irresponsible cable news reporting, and a lot of kind of quirky, interesting things happening in the land of audio.
Great. As you were talking, I was thinking about the sort of cable news, the map show that was on for days and days as a kind of extremely mediocre, non-consensual American politics seminar, right?
Yes.
One fact, which was 270.
Yeah, it's just there was so much more interesting stuff to talk about. And they kept showing the same shot of the Philly count. It was genuinely bad television, but we're all watching it like this.
Right.
So we rewarded the bad behavior. So
indeed. Well, I've got a question here from one of our politics seniors, Jordan Crawford, and he asks, the general rhetoric surrounding the need for supporting the Biden-Harris vote is framed through their ability to unite the country after 4 years of Donald Trump. But still, over 68 million Americans voted for Trump. My question to you is, how do you see the president-elect's ability to unite America when there is such an obvious case of hate and partisanship on social issues such as BLM, COVID, etc.? How do you stay hopeful that Biden and Harris can actually achieve these goals in light of Trump supporters' base?
So, Jordan, thank you for that question. I really appreciate it. So I don't think presidents unite countries. That's just, I will begin there. So let me back up. I think unity has its value, and it also has some very important limitations. I am actually most optimistic when democracy is its most messy. I know it is very painful to live in this moment. It has been a painful 4 years to live in. But the most important aspect of that, from my perspective, is the material agony. It is the actual 500 children who are still separated from their parents. It is the actual 250,000 nearly Americans who are gone from the coronavirus. Those material realities of suffering, of inequality, of suppression, of oppression, are the things that I am most concerned that we repair. The affective and intellectual experience of feeling disconnected from our nation worries me a little less. And let me just explain why. Again, I want to try to start us at the standpoint of Black America and say, what do we learn if we start with the Black experience at the center of the story that we're telling? And so if we start at that place, if we say, what does it mean to live in a nation where it's pretty clear to you that either an absolute majority, an overwhelming majority, or at least a strong proportion of the people who you share your country with are not only opposed to you and your ideas, but are opposed to your life, are willing to either actively seek to kill you or to punish you for simply being, or to look the other way why that happens. And that is the experience of my ancestors. Now, I want to be clear. I don't claim that experience in my own blood and fingers and toes. Like I was not enslaved. I was not Jim Crow, but my father was. When I talked to my father's 80 or 79, he just had his birthday. And I asked him a question this year that you would have thought I would have asked my dad before this. But for the first time I asked him, Daddy, do you remember the first time you voted? And he said, yeah, it was 1960. My twin brother and I went down and we paid our poll tax that summer and then we voted. Now I want to be clear, this is my father. This is not my grandfather. This is my dad, my children, right? I have a daughter in college and it's her grandfather paid poll taxes. It is the normative experience across American history for Black people to live in a country that actively and openly hates them and legislates that hate. And for Black people to do kind of extraordinary things like come up out of 200 plus years of enslavement. And the first thing we do is register to vote, run for office, and attempt to reproduce the aspirational goals of American democracy. So if we feel bad or if we feel embattled, I am much less worried than those who are actually, right? And I think both are true at the same time. But it's just to say, I don't believe that democracy is unhealthy inherently because we are divided. I don't believe that democracy is unhealthy inherently because we disagree, even unto the point of like vehement, nasty, like human disagreement. I don't think that means democracy is wrong, because democracy is the set of rules by which we try to govern ourselves, which is still quite a youthful experiment in all of human history. So what I would say is I don't think unity is itself the goal. And two, if it was the goal, I certainly don't think presidents can do it. I've never seen a president who brings people together in my lifetime. I remembered when people loved Reagan, and that was not how we felt in my household. I remember people who loved Clinton, and lots of other houses didn't feel that way. I know how it felt the 8 years of the Obama administration. Even we were mad with Obama. Black people were like having a whole American festival for 8 years. And that is clearly not how much of the rest of the country was feeling. So presidents don't bring people together. Presidents tend to reflect how divided we are, or how united we are as an electorate, not as a people, but as an electorate. So the last thing I will say is, because I don't think presidents do it, I am interested in how in the next several years, we, decide to engage what this America is going to be into the 2020s and the 2030s. It will not all happen in 4 years or even in 8, but to try to think about what thresholds we may have crossed after 2 terms of a Black president and then a clear 1 term of a backlash, and now a kind of return to a sort of racial normality, which is not all good, but is somehow less like assaulting on a day-to-day basis.
I think picking up on some of those themes, this is a question from Professor Pasha in our rhetoric department, thinking about the relationship between protest and electoral politics and governance. Do you think BLM activists will benefit from a seat at the table in the Biden-Harris administration? What other avenues for change do you think we will see in 2021?
Yeah, I mean, BLM got on it this year. So it's also kind of interesting for me to watch as someone who hosted I hosted a national television show from 2012 to 2016. And then I have basically been out of public space really after 2016, except for these kinds of things that I do in an academic space. And so, I saw the first iteration of Black Lives Matter, and I reported on the first iteration, and I got to know very closely the activists who were part of that first iteration, what I might think of as the Ferguson generation. So they're not actually generationally distinct, they're actually more like waves, but that first group really comes out of Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown, and really in terms of taking to the streets, it's the Dream Defenders in Florida, and it is the activists in Ferguson. And Cori Bush, who was one of those leaders in Ferguson, just won a congressional seat in Missouri, right? And then there's this group of activists who, again, some of them are the actual same people, but many of them are of the leaders, like were maybe they were like the younger ones in that first cohort, and now they're in a different place of leadership, and they emerge right at the George Floyd, Breonna Taylor moments, right? So there's the Ferguson, like the Trayvon and Ferguson generation, and then there is the George Floyd, Breonna Taylor group. And here's what's crucially different. Wave 1, we have Barack Obama as president, Eric Holder as attorney general, and during part of that time also Democratic control of the House. The idea of how you lead a movement and even potentially the irrelevance of voting makes sense. Think about that, right? You have a Black president, you have a Black attorney general, right? You have a Democrat who is the House Speaker, you have Democrats in majority in the House, and you're being murdered in the street. Of course, you say, voting is not that important, right? Of course, you would emphasize the like pure protest over the voting, because in certain ways you've already won the vote, right? You're in office, and it's still happening. So this time when it emerges in the context, one, of an election year, but also with a Trump presidency and with a Senate that is quite controlled by the Republicans in such a way that it has had now an enormous sort of handwriting on the court. Of course, it makes sense in that context that you would emphasize voting, that you would emphasize voter registration, that you would think about electoral power as also being core to the movement. So I see Black Lives Matter in both cases, both wave 1 and 2, as responding to the political reality in which it found itself and was birthed. And I would expect that to continue to be true as we move forward. Again, just think about that in the context of, for example, the integrationist-based civil rights movement of the 1950s that occurs before you have the vote, and then a Black Power movement that emerges after you officially have the right to vote, but these racial inequalities are still so sticky. And so then you get a Black Power movement that says it's not primarily about the vote, it's about these other things. And all of that is to say, at every point, Black women still had the highest voter turnout. So some of it is just discursive because behaviorally, Black people are still like voting. And at every point are clearly, and especially when you look at 2018 and young people of all races and this like extraordinary voter turnout that occurred for a midterm election in 2018.
Mm-hmm. So another question from one of our students in the politics department, Jasmine, is asking, Is there a danger in this surge of support for the Biden administration? Are our expectations so low for a presidency that you predict many will not hold the Biden administration accountable or sort of romanticize or glorify them in the process? So some good old politics cynicism for you.
I love it. Come on, y'all. Just wait. I mean, a surge in support has been like 48 hours. But look, here, let me say, I am cranky. I'm old. I'm Southern. I'm cranky. I had to vote for John Kerry in my life. Like, and I will repeat, I am not a fan of Vice President-elect Kamala Harris. And it's just petty and personal. I just want to be clear. I could make a big, deep argument about her being a prosecutor and a district attorney and all of that, but it's really not so much that per se as it is that I have a sister who has spent 25 years as a public defender in San Francisco. And so basically for 25 years, I've been hearing the name Kamala Harris across the dinner table as like the person that my sister is fighting against. And so like, I just, a lot of it is just real. She's like, light-skinned girls often hate on other light-skinned girls. So there's a lot of like weird internal, like hateration, petty politics going on with me. But so I don't weep at Kamala Harris as vice president. I also just like know the vice presidency doesn't mean much. But what does make me weep, like I keep just bursting into tears every time I hear a good NPR story that is talking to Black women who are not college professors, whose sisters were public defenders, who are the voters who made everything happen. When I hear them say how much it means to them, then it softens me. So what I will say is this: my bet is that there's going to be plenty of cynicism. There's going to be plenty of critique that the ways that many, particularly Black communities, often did not criticize the Obama administration will not happen with Biden, that what we're going to see with Biden is going to be something closer to what happened with Black communities in Clinton, which is to say there will be some failure to critique, but there will be still more room because he's not a racial insider. And I don't believe that a vice president don't critique Joe because he's Kamala's, principal. I don't see that as how that will happen. And I actually think that it is good for people in this moment to feel a certain sense of enthusiasm about democracy. Again, the man doesn't have a cabinet yet. He hasn't been inaugurated. So if people want to feel like a little enthusiasm that maybe there'll be a national mask mandate, it's really the only policy I'm going for, then I can appreciate the need to feel that sense of relief and enthusiasm and feel as though we've won, right? Whatever the we is and whatever winning looks like. But, right, and then I will say this and I will caution, but what happens with first-term presidents is they begin to run for re-election immediately. And if the DNC and if the Biden administration and if empowered Democrats believe that the story of this election is the triumph of moderation, and if they believe that to the extent that there were losses, that those losses were caused by progressivism, then we do have a real danger if they draw the wrong lessons. So this might go back to the question you asked earlier about media, Dr. Beachy, and how when media gives too much room to a single narrative without thinking about and providing real space, not like, both sides of the story, but like multiple sides of just the left and multiple sides of just the right, that we can end up actually pushing leaders to adopt a dominant narrative that isn't fully supported by the data. And that would be my suggestion is I think people are going to do the accountability holding, especially organizers and activists. I think it's okay for people to feel enthusiastic for like 48, even 72, hell, a whole month. If people wanted to feel good, like in 1 month of 2020, I'm going to give it to them. The danger is if you start hearing Democratic leadership say that what this is a story of moderation, white men retaking the Democratic Party, and the need to move away from progressivism in order to embrace conservatism. That all of that would be when I would start to be concerned. And I heard it for the first time, I will just say, on ABC News, when commentator praised the moment after the Civil War when when the North, the Union, reached back out to heal the country by bringing the Confederates back in. And I thought, I'm sorry, is that the story? Is that the narrative? That's the lesson you took from that moment? Because my people, we have a different story about that. So that is when that was the first time I felt like actual danger, but not when Black women are enthusiastically weeping because we've shattered a glass ceiling with with Vice President-elect Harris.
I had a couple of questions here about folks who were struck by your consumption of conservative media. So,
yeah.
Question: what conservative media do you recommend? I'd love to hear more about how the other side thinks, but I don't know which sources to trust. And another question.
Sorry.
I'm going to give you two that are on one. What your thoughts are another question about. Where'd it go? What have you learned from listening to right-wing radio? Is there a way of crafting a narrative that's particularly persuasive? So what do you listen to?
Such good questions. All right. So in terms of things to read, the American Conservative, which is both digital and in print. So the American Conservative magazine, National Review, and in National Review, quite specifically, Michael Brendan Daugherty. Michael is a friend, might be a strong word, but we certainly have been great coworkers, and he's a very, very smart and interesting thinker. Now, I will say he's weirdly obsessed in a negative way with Meghan Markle. Like, I keep telling him he should just, he has this whole belief that Meghan Markle ruined Harry's life. And I'm like, this is not, stop it, Michael. But Michael Brendan Daugherty from the National Review. And then the third I would say is Reason Magazine. So my favorite conservatives are libertarians. Why? Because libertarians often manage to wrap back around to many positions I share. So libertarians are the conservatives in the world who are anti-criminal justice, right? They tend to be, pro-criminal justice, anti-criminal punishment, right? So they tend to be more likely to want to legalize recreational use of low-level drugs, right? Sometimes actually very high-level drugs, because it's their belief that basically any ways in which the government infringes upon sort of individual liberty and freedom. Now, I'm not myself a libertarian, but I do at moments have libertarian impulses, especially when I'm feeling distrustful of the government. And so, during a time when there was an administration with whom I mostly disagreed, libertarian magazines and spaces were great because they kind of hate the government all the time, no matter who's in charge of it. And so they can make really smart, interesting arguments. So again, the American Conservative, the National Review, and Reason. And again, the reason I like all three of those is that this is really like the core of American conservative thought. American Conservative was pretty much anti-Trump most of the entire, Trump presidency. I will say they mostly did support his judicial nominees, but this was really valuable for me, for example, to be reading it because I understood how important those court pieces were to keeping President Trump right within the party, within American conservatism, because for all the things they disagreed with, because they understood the court to be so crucial, and because all of his federal appointments all the way down basically came straight from their lists, he was able to maintain, like if you ever ask yourself, why aren't Republicans mad at President Trump? Because of the courts, right? And I only know that from having read a lot of conservative writing. I live in North Carolina, so sometimes I listen to conservative radio without meaning to. Like I just turn on the radio and it's like the morning show, but it turns out it's pretty conservative. So I don't listen to Rush Limbaugh and screaming and yelling and that kind of thing. But I do listen to sort of conservative leaning local radio. In part because these are my neighbors. My kids go to school with their kids, we grocery shop together. And mostly what I have learned from that more than any other single thing is that, most human beings are pretty darn human. And even when leaders on both sides are pretty appallingly inhumane, when you listen to ordinary folks talk even in ways that are about conspiracy, theories, you still get like a real clear sense of humanity, right? So there is and was such fear of the coronavirus that I don't think ever gets like, they show you Trump rallies where people are not afraid of coronavirus, but that is a tiny minority of American conservatives, right? The vast majority of American conservatives were like, ordinary people walking around the streets were terrified of coronavirus. They just understood it really differently, right? And didn't necessarily believe the mask mandate, and definitely didn't believe Anthony Fauci, and didn't believe government medicine. And like, all of those things help you to also understand why Biden can't like bring the country together, because it's not about like, did you talk nicely? It's that there is a deep distrust. And the very last thing I'll say is, I did tell a lie when I said I hadn't watched cable news, because I did watch Fox News from the day that Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed through to the nomination and confirmation hearings of Amy Coney Barrett. I watched Fox News, and I have to say it is because I don't care what MSNBC was saying about her. I mean, not that I care about MSNBC's everything, but I didn't care even what CNN or any sort of more progressive or even presumably straight line source. I really wanted to hear what conservatives thought about Amy Coney Barrett. What were they saying? What was the framework? How did they understand what made her great? And again, it's not as though I had agreement with it, but it was really, really useful for me to hear how those arguments were framed.
Great. Returning back to the election, what conclusions should we draw from the persistent white support for Donald Trump? So the white women and white men who continue to so strongly support Donald Trump in this election.
Well, I think the most important thing we should draw from it is that white people are Republicans. And I know we would like something much more nefarious than that. But overwhelmingly, I can tell you exactly how you're going to vote by knowing what your partisan self-identification is. And, let me be really clear about this. There is a big difference between big difference. There are meaningful differences that we should ask research questions about from what we would call chronic voters, people who vote in every election and always vote the same way relative to partisanship. Because for those voters, it's like, what does a Democrat have to do for me to not vote for them? I thought about this a lot. I am a North Carolina voter, and I had to vote for Cal Cunningham or Tom Tillis. So when I tell you that I thought about this a lot this year, because I had, in fact, zero desire. If I wasn't a political scientist, I clearly would have left that Senate seat blank on my ballot. But I know too much about why not to do that. But it was excruciating to choose Cal Cunningham, but I did it. And I really only did it for one reason, not for Cal Cunningham. I sort of hoped he'd fall off of something, literally, and like break all the things and not be able to go to the Senate. But I voted for him because I looked at the Senate balance of power, and I decided that having a Democratic Senate balance of power would be more beneficial to the sets of public policies, and particularly to the courts that I care about. So what I have to know is that for many Republican voters, they voted for Donald Trump like this, right? That for them, there may be a lot of reasons not to support Trump, but there's also some real structural reasons to support Trump. Now, there is also, so that's one portion of white Republican voters. There's also a portion of white Republican voters who, and I think this is part of what's important about how many more voters we had this time. There's a portion of white Republican voters who are voting for Trump quite specifically to send a racialized and gendered message, a message about white men's power, a message about what America should be and what it should look like, a message that is violently anti-immigrant. I mean, and I say violently because I cannot fathom anything more violent than separating children from their families, apparently permanently, since there are 500 plus children who still are not reunited with their families. But what I also know is this: from 2012 to 2016, I regularly reported on family separation at the border under the Obama administration. Now, I do not say that as a matter of false equivalency or saying what's happening now is just like then. It's not, it is different. Children were not separated in such a way that they didn't know where their parents, there are very, very crucial and real differences. But I did report on that. We had people speaking in Spanish on an English language television and being simultaneously translated so that we could tell those stories. And they were consistently my second lowest ratings. My lowest ratings came whenever I talked about the environment. And my second lowest ratings came whenever we talked about the Obama immigration policy. And I say that to say, Democrats were not interested in those stories of injustice during a Democratic presidency. And particularly, folks didn't want to hear it because I don't believe the Democratic voters voted for Barack Obama saying, I hate Mexicans. I hope they get deported and separated from their family. Like, I don't think that's why they voted for him. I think they voted for him for 1,000 other reasons and were willing to look the other way about drones in the Middle East. They were willing to look the other way about family separation at the border. They were willing to look the other way about an immigration policy that includes an incentive to keep beds full in the mass incarcerations at the border. And I mean, all of that was public knowledge, and Black people gave 94% of their votes. And I don't think it's because they supported those policies. So I have to leave open the possibility that there is a majority of white Americans who are voting for the Republican because he's the Republican. Now, how he got to be the Republican candidate is really important. And it's a big and complicated story that includes media and includes our primary system and includes like all sorts of things that are going on with it. But I don't want us to too much over imagine that it means something quite specific. And the last thing I'll say is, if you look at data over time, white women have, let me say again, this is one of those media things. Media will tell you that there is a gender gap. There is not a gender gap, which is to say women who are white, okay? So when I say there's not a gender gap, let me explain. Women who are white have, since Franklin Roosevelt, split their vote about 50-50. The only elections since Franklin Roosevelt where white women gave a majority. So it's always about 50-50, but maybe 53, 52, 51, 51. The only times when that majority went to the Democrat was the election of John F. Kennedy, the re-election of Bill Clinton. In every other single election in modern American electoral history, white women are 50-50 with a majority going to the Republican. In every single election. So the idea that people are like falling out, freaking out right now, oh my God, you did exactly what you have done in every election since the 1940s. Like, it's actually only electoral madness to think it would somehow be different. The reason it seems like there's a gender gap is because Black women and Latinas vote overwhelmingly for the Democratic candidate. So in every election since 1965, Black women have given 85 to 95% of their vote to the Democratic candidate. So if you don't run a crosstab and you just do a dummy variable on gender, it will look like there is a gender gap. There is no gender gap. Everyone who ever says that on news should just have like darts thrown at their head, because it's not what it is. It is a racialized gap that happens to be gendered. And then the last thing I'll say is, so therefore, when you're looking at those red and blue graphs, and you're like mad at, as I like to say, you're mad at Becky for voting for the Republican, even though Becky's been voting for the Republican since the 1940s. Mm-hmm. The real question I have is for Tyrone. Why is it that Black men in 2008 and 2012 gave 90% of their vote for Barack Obama, but only 80% for both Hillary Clinton and then Joe Biden? Now, I don't know the answer to that, but I do think that for me is a more interesting question, because the idea that Black men and Black women vote so very differently, there's a 15-point gap between Black men and Black women, when in fact our policy and economic interests are so closely aligned, suggests to me that there are some real differences in how Black men understand their political interest.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's super interesting. I hope you'll write that book, in your spare time.
Let me tell you, there's a long history of Black feminists who ask those kinds of questions about Black men and get thrown all the way out of the community. And I like my community, so I'm going to stay in.
can write the book, the one about the intersectionality of the gender
Yes.
gap.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I want to, I know we're running short on time here, but I wanted to save some space here at the end for your provocation of hope. There were a number of questions that were engaging with this. So one from Blythe, one of our students, and I'll read a couple of questions here. What are your thoughts on this coming period from now to the inauguration in terms of hope, pandemic, protest, and politics? From Professor Knight in our biology department. Would you share your own thoughts on whether you feel 2021 will be a year of power? What gives you hope that it will? And then a question from one of our alums, power for whom? So I'll let you take us off in whichever direction you'd like to go there.
Great. There's also some good ones. So I want to just acknowledge Eunice's question, which asked about the polling, the exit polls. And it's a great question and exactly right, which is, and exit polls might totally be off this time because exit polls are usually really good because we know that those people actually voted. But of course, we know that more than 100 million Americans voted before Election Day. And more than half of those, actually, I think maybe 2/3 voted by mail. And so our exit polling methodologies are way off. And so, the other way to think of this is that the most likely alternative fact or alternative outcome is that basically they're exactly the same in 2020 as they were in 2016. Basically, if you were to just sort of correct by 3 percentage points all the way down that list, you'd end up with basically precisely the numbers that we had in 2016. But even that is a surprise, right? The idea that so many more people could show up, but that the percentages would move really not at all would suggest we're kind of calcified. And there's also another fabulous question in here about, am I worried about white supremacy? Always. I am always worried about white supremacy. But let me, and I don't mean to laugh, but like, I'm always worried about it. And in some ways, what I would say is, as much as I'm always worried about it, I am in hopefully less fully anxious about it right in this moment, really for one reason, which is that I'm allowed to say white supremacy and people aren't like, that doesn't even exist anymore. That one of the horrors and gifts of this particular moment has been expressions of institutional and interpersonal racism that make it, that has eased the capacity to have a real conversation about the continuing effects of white supremacy. During the Obama years, the only word you could use was implicit bias. Almost no one even needs to talk about implicit bias anymore because it's not implicit bias that's kneeling on your neck for 9 minutes, right? That is not, there's nothing implicit about that, right? That is an active use of force and power. And so I think as much as I'm always worried about the forces of white supremacy, I never worry about them so much that I can't activate. And I am excited about our capacity to at least name it, see it, and interracially organize around it. And so when you ask me about, and then someone also said, is Georgia going to make it to January? Ma'am, let me say, everything that I know as a political scientist says no. Everything I know as a political scientist says that you cannot sustain this level of mobilization, especially after you've had a win at the top, right? Come January, that the attention, that the money of the parties, that all of that will simply not sustain it. But a lot of what I know as a political scientist also would have said Georgia would not have been blue this time. And so what I'll say is I am doubtful from what a long sort of knowledge of modeling tells me about what happens in these kinds of runoffs, but I'm extremely hopeful because I know enough about those organizations like New Georgia Project and Fair Fight and others that they are not playing by these kind of normal rules. And then, listen, here's what I'll say. I really do. I'm not just shilling for my podcast. I don't make any more money if you go listen to it. But I would say when you're asking about optimism, because I think the best words actually don't come from me, but from one of our guests on the podcast. So if you have a moment to go to System Check, we're on The Nation. So you just go to thenation.com/system check. Listen to this week's episode, so the most recent episode, and I think it's called something about white supremacy. In the first, maybe 15, 20 minutes, we talk about the ways that we count the vote and the ways that it shapes our and misshapes national outcomes, particularly the Electoral College. But then I'd really point you to the second interview. The second interview is with a friend and colleague named Blair Kelly. She's a professor of history at NC State. And I asked her in the episode specifically about 1900, because there's been a lot of conversation about 1900. It was the last time we had a voter turnout this high. And the 1900 presidential election was actually a rematch of the 1896 presidential election. And if you know anything about 1896 or about 1900, you'll know that 1896 is the year the Supreme Court decides Plessy v. Ferguson and establishes separate but equal. And 1900 is the beginning of what we call the nadir, kind of the lowest point in American public policy relative to race, with the descent of the sort of the most vile and violent aspects of Jim Crow. And so I asked her, is this 1900? Are we, here you had this huge voter turnout, and it was in order to instantiate white racism and white supremacy and white domination and control for what would become another basically 65 to 70 years. And she tells these pretty extraordinary stories about the people, the newspaper people, so the journalist of the time, who didn't know, right? In 1900, you don't know that you're about to enter 65 years of Jim Crow. And in fact, J. Max Barber, who she talks about, he's coming out of the end of enslavement and out of the period of Reconstruction. And they thought it was a time of great opening and celebration. And then it wasn't. And so on the one hand, it's a very depressing story. But if you listen to Professor Kelly talk about it, she'll say, and so who am I? Who am I not to be brave in this moment? She talks about her own ancestor who voted literally with his mark, with his X. He made his mark because he could not read and write. And she's like, did he have a progressive candidate to vote for? Was he voting for somebody who was like really concerned about his life opportunities? Of course not. And yet the struggle that we find ourselves in is attached to and connected to a very long and painful and agonizing struggle. And the reason that should make us feel better is simply because we are not exempt. We too have to live in a time of pandemic, just as our ancestors who lived in 1918. Yep. And us too. We're not so cute or special or technology, fabulous that we don't have to live in a pandemic. And we have lived through an ascendance of white supremacy. Yep. Just like our grandfathers and great grandmothers who lived through periods of this ascendancy of white supremacy. And we got 8 whole years of a Black president, and we just now got a Black and South Asian vice president. And so in the whole balance of it, the extraordinary level of opening and possibility that we live with keeps us from ever being allowed to be cowardly. So it doesn't mean it's going to be okay, but it does mean we have a historic responsibility to be courageous.
I love that. So folks, check out the podcast System Check and the conversation between Professor Harris Perry and Professor Kelly. And as a promo, we are going to be hosting Professor Kelly on a Zoom near you at Whitman College. History.
Oh, I didn't know that. I wasn't.
Yeah, no, it's perfect. So your homework after this assignment is to go listen to the podcast in preparation for the spring Zoom, where we're going to be continuing these conversations on race, violence, and health across the spring. And so we hope folks will continue to join us for that. But please join me in virtually thanking Professor Harris Perry for her brilliance and her time and her energy and enthusiasm, and for that moment of hope, which I think we all need and appreciate. So thank you so much for being here, Professor Harris Perry.
Thank you all for taking the evening. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone.